As a kid, the way I thought about my racial identity was uncomplicated. I'd look in the mirror and picture myself as exactly half and half. The right side of my body, Indian and brown. The left side, British and white. I grew up in a small city in the Midwest, and my family was active in our community, so I never felt like I had to explain my racial or ethnic identity to anyone. People just knew. Fast forward to 2007. I graduated from high school in the same small city and moved almost 1,000 miles away to go to college. And in the months that followed, I had almost daily experiences in which I felt super aware of a dissonance between how I felt on the inside and how other folks perceived me. While some people knew immediately that I was mixed or had Indian heritage, others thought I was white. And the more new encounters I had, the more confused I became. Should I have a short phrase I use to explain myself? Do I just assume that if it's an encounter that matters, identity will naturally come up? Looking back, I can see that the questions that emerged for me as an 18-year-old signified a shift into mixed race adulthood. This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao.
My dad is Black and my mother is white. But if you were just a person passing me on the street, you would not think that I was biracial. When I tell people I'm biracial, or when people find out, there's like this snap response where people will be like, no, you're not. I'm like, yes, I am. I'm biracial. My dad's Black and my mom is white. No, you're not. I get that so often and I don't know why. I'm really proud of my identity. I'm proud of who I am.
I think when I was a kid, I cared a lot about being understood. You know, people just see me and see my face and don't see a picture of my family and don't know about my family history. And I feel like one of the things that I've gotten better at is kind of understanding what people are asking and why they're asking and just giving the information that people are looking for as opposed to like the whole version of the whole story.
So I was about either 19 or 20, and I had my first relationship at the time. And I remember I was set to meet her mother. We got to the dinner that night, and during the entire dinner, her mother didn't acknowledge me. She wouldn't look me in the eyes. Although I felt like my entire life I have been racialized as something other than white, this was my first time really experiencing anti-Blackness. I think that was a wake-up call for me. Sometimes, having lighter skin has, I would say, advantages. But that was the first time really in my young developing ages that it really felt real in that type of way.
More than 30 million Americans identify as being of two or more races, and that number is on the rise. But what it means to be a mixed person is highly specific to the individual. I know from my own 30-some years on this earth that the experience is ever shifting. And some of the first big changes are brought on by the simple act of getting older.
I think when I was growing up, there was definitely less of a conversation around being mixed. Like, I definitely was cognizant of the fact that I was mixed, but it was never something that really was like cast into sharp focus for me until I got to school. And I felt like I needed to be like categorized to a degree by my peers in order to fit in.
That's Adiah Siler. She's 21 and a rising senior at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. Her dad is Black and her mom is white. She grew up in a Pennsylvania suburb and has some distinct childhood memories of noting racial dissonance, like when she was little and her mom was struggling to figure out how to do her hair, or when she got together with her dad's side of the family at big gatherings and didn't quite feel like she belonged. As she transitioned to college, she started to reflect more on how all those small moments of her childhood fit together.
I go to school in Philadelphia, so it's obviously like a very, very Black city. There are a lot of ways in which I've been given more opportunities to explore my Blackness and my relationship to my Blackness within like a new context. At my like my original high school or when I was coming up through elementary school at the very white institutions that I was attending, I didn't feel safe enough to explore those parts of me without like criticism. So I would kind of let myself be like the butt of jokes or let myself be like the only Black person in a given situation. And now I feel like there is so much Blackness around that I have like the option to kind of explore in ways that I wasn't afforded when I was living in my like small town growing up.
Another person in the midst of that transition to adulthood is Claire Gallagher. She grew up in LA as a mixed Chinese and white person. Although the city itself is racially diverse, her private high school wasn't. And she too experienced being the butt of some racist jokes.
People would make jokes about like me being like a bad driver or like having small eyes, stuff like that. But I think people were really interested in being politically correct. So I think that directing those jokes at me felt more comfortable to people, like almost like it was like more acceptable because I also am white, and that like proximity I think made the jokes feel like they like weren't offensive.
Claire, like me, moved really far away to go to college. And that shift from LA to Ann Arbor, Michigan was a culture shock. But it wasn't all bad.
Having to kind of feel like you need to like re-explain yourself to a new community of people can be daunting, but I never felt like the friends that I made like saw me in any sort of like different way. I've always felt really like understood and welcomed by the friends that I made. I mean, I started writing for Michigan in Color, and that was definitely a really good community for me to join and helped me work through a lot of like any imposter syndrome feelings that I was having.
So I didn't really know any mixed folks who were my age until I went to college. And I know how important those friendships were for me in the process of kind of naming the challenges I faced as a mixed race adult. Claire, the person who was your roommate your first year in college, who's still a close friend, is also Asian and white. And I'm curious about how being in such close proximity to her and how that friendship shaped how you think about your own identity.
Yeah, so I was really lucky with my freshman year roommate situation. We just like met each other on Facebook. And I definitely think that recognizing that she was also half Asian and half white was part of the reason why I wanted to reach out to her in the first place. Because growing up, I didn't really have any other mixed race friends, but like we ended up just clicking immediately, and she's still one of my best friends. And I think having her as kind of the first friend I made at school was really important for me, in terms of feeling like I belonged there and like helping me make other friends too. I think for a lot of mixed kids, sometimes it's good to have siblings who really understand the exact situation that you're in, but having a friend that has similar experiences has been really important, and I'm really lucky to have her.
You do have a sister. I'm curious about that relationship and the conversations that you all had growing up about racial identity and physical appearance, because often siblings don't necessarily present exactly the same way. I know that's true for me and my siblings. I'm curious about your experience.
Yeah, we don't really talk to our dad side of the family, and it was kind of something that we would almost use against each other growing up. I think people have always said that she looks a lot more like our mom, and people would tell us that she looks more Chinese and that I look whiter. And we would, like, in a snarky way, like, tell each other, like, you're being so white right now, or like, you're Chinese, like, your accent's so bad, your accent's so white. Saying those things to each other to hurt each other, because we really wanted to be like our mom. So that was like obviously bad in our relationship growing up. But now, I mean, we've like matured and moved past that. And we've, had conversations about how it feels. But I think I always kind of like a little bit resented her for looking more Chinese in a lot of family situations growing up. Like if we'd be with our family eating at a restaurant and the waiter would speak to everyone in Chinese and then speak to me in English,
Ugh,
I felt really
yes.
hurt. And I felt like, okay, like, am I not seen as being part of my family? So I think I resented her for that for like a long time. But, obviously it's like siblings are really important in like support systems. So obviously I'm trying to not still feel that way.
I'm curious, Adia, what your experience has been. I know you have two younger brothers, so maybe it doesn't have as much of that sister dynamic, but what have you learned about how y'all's different appearances have shaped your mixed experiences?
Yeah, I definitely felt throughout my life that we all were treated or perceived slightly differently. We all present differently. One of my brothers, I call like my big little brother because he's like 6'4" and he's like only 2 years younger than me. So he is like a little bit darker than me, but his hair was always like not as like kinky as mine was. And my littlest brother is like very light skinned, has very like almost like a traditionally like biracial sort of mixed race look, and that his hair is like very light and wavy, even though there's no like traditional sort of way to be mixed. I find that it's really interesting to see how we all try to fit in with either side of our family. It's like a classic sort of thing, like being too much of one thing to fit into either side. But I definitely find that with my family, me and my brother who's close to my age often identify with each other like very quickly. Like we have like a very like unique sort of experience from either side of our families. So there's like a sense of shame that comes when we see our Black family of feeling like our proximity to whiteness makes us not as in tune with them. And then there's like a sort of annoyed sort of understanding that we have when we're with our white side of the family of like, okay, they're going to microaggress without realizing, and we have to kind of keep it pushing. I find that like that in betweenness that we both sort of harbor makes our relationship really, really interesting and really unique in that way.
As y'all are talking about this, I'm thinking that I really haven't talked with my parents much about my reflections on feeling different from my siblings. I'm curious about if you all have. Adi, I'll start with you. Like, is this something that you talk to your parents about, or does it really stay among siblings?
I talk to my parents about it a bit, but I always feel as though their own relationships with their race are so different than mine that I do find it difficult to like fully get them to understand. And to a degree, like I completely get it. Like my father is a dark-skinned Black man and my mom is white. So I feel like it's hard for either of them to fully get it. And I don't pass judgment on either of them for that because I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, they're completely different identities, but I do think that it's something that I don't know if they thought too much about it before they had us. So I've tried to talk to them about it, but I find that maybe it's because of how they grew up or when they had us, like early 2000s, that they find it, I think, more effective to talk about race, but talk like a little bit less about like what it means to be like a mixed, like interracial family, I guess.
That totally makes sense. And Claire, I know you mentioned not growing up with both parents, but did you and your sister talk to your mom about these feelings of wanting to be perceived as Chinese or any of those microaggressions you were experiencing at school of people, using your proximity to whiteness as a way to stereotype you?
Yeah, I feel like I really agree with what Audio was saying about like, I don't really think it was something that my parents thought about when they had me and my sister. I really haven't had that many conversations about being mixed with my mom, but it's kind of interesting because I think that me and my roommate, who I talked about, have had a lot of conversations about our anxiety about having kids. And
Yes. Talk to me
if
more about
we
that.
like, we have like a lot of anxieties around like who we have kids with and then what our kids would look like and what that means for how we go about different cultural practices. I mean, my mom makes a lot of jokes about like if me and my sister have kids with a white guy that everyone will think she's like the nanny and then no one will think she's related to us.
No, that is so, so real. My sister met her husband when she was in college, and he is Indian American, and they have kids who definitely look Indian. And I'm in a partnership with a white person, and I feel so much longing for what I know that her kids will experience that my kids wouldn't, of just not being perceived as Indian in a certain way or being perceived as very white, and that grief is very real and very confusing. Adi, I'm curious about how you're thinking about that. And does that shape how you date and who you date at all?
Absolutely. I feel like very seen by what you said, Claire. That I feel like I do have a lot of anxieties around it, and it does shape the way in which that I go about dating. For me, I know a big part of my Black identity comes from having my Black family. I have my dad and I have my brothers, and my home base feels like Black. So even if I'm at a PWI, even if the friends that I'm making lean white or my partner is white, I know that my family and my core, at my core, I have that connection. So I think when you are dating white people, there is this fear that if you are going to create this new sense of a family, that there is going to be that missing. That has always been a big anxiety of mine, and something that I'm very curious about. I am dating somebody that's white right now, and I find that that's a big discussion with us.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about what it means. We're also I'm also in a queer relationship, so that's an interesting dynamic when it comes to if we do have kids, how are we, you know what I mean? How do you go about that? Do you adopt? I'm very against adopting outside of a race that either of us identify with. So it's a very interesting sort of conversation around who do you end up with and how do you center your Blackness while also honoring the fact that you are with a white person. It's a very interesting thing that, and I think anxiety is a good word for it, what Claire said, because I think there can be a lot of shame around the idea of not leaning into the part of your identity that is marginalized in order to propagate this new world. But it's it's a complicated thing for sure.
Feels like so much responsibility, to think about, Claire, as you were saying, to be the one who's okay, I have to know all the cultural traditions. I have to be the one responsible for passing those forward. Have you had conversations, Claire, in dating relationships that have felt affirming in thinking about how a partner could support your mixed identity and this desire to feel connected with your Chinese heritage?
I haven't really had that many serious relationships. My first boyfriend I ever had was really supportive about my identity and how I felt. He was white and definitely made an effort with my family, and that was my first experience. But since that relationship, I've had a lot of experiences with guys where it just felt really fetishizy. When I was younger, I was talking to this guy who really didn't show me any sort of physical affection, never really affirmed the way that he felt about me at all, but would talk about having kids together, but only in the context of oh, our kids would be so cute, because he thought that mixed kids would look really cute together. But by no means were we going on dates or in any way moving towards a future where we would have kids. And I've had a handful of guys tell me that they love Asian girls, their type is Asian girls. They think Asian girls are so hot. I think it's really strange to say that your type is a race
Yes.
or that you prefer a race if it's not for cultural reasons. And it's hard to make people that you're dating understand, because they see it as a compliment.
Hey y'all, I'm Anita Khalifa. If you like the thoughtful conversations you get on Embodied, you may also like the podcast I host called The Broadside. Each week, we tell stories from our home in North Carolina at the crossroads of the South. The Broadside dives into issues that might not be on the front page, but deserve a closer look, like how a small town became the cricket capital of the South, or how our relationship to soda has evolved over the last century. Find The Broadside from WUNC wherever you get your podcasts.
Adiah and Claire are way more evolved than I was at that age. As I was getting ready for my conversation with them, I took a real trip down memory lane and I revisited my college application essay. And y'all, the way I talked about my mixed race identity as an 18-year-old was so bad. I will not subject you to the direct quotes, but just so you get the gist, the essay started with an extended metaphor about a jungle in which there lived a Bengali tiger, an English hound dog, and an American eagle. And I was a multicolored parrot. I cried real tears when I was rereading it because I was laughing so hard. But behind the awful metaphors were a lot of real questions that I'm still working through. Like, how do you navigate mixed identity in romantic relationships? And how do you find that elusive sense of belonging as a mixed person? These are questions that are really hard to answer on your own. Enter life coach Sarah Lotus Garrett.
One of the most empowering things that happens in the course that I hold is that moment when mixed people realize, oh, my identity is going to shift depending on the context, where I am, who I'm with, and I cannot be relying on the narratives and the gatekeeping of others in order to feel whole within myself about my mixed identity.
That course Sarah mentioned, it's a 10-week virtual program she runs for mixed adults, which includes both individual coaching sessions and meetings with a cohort. The whole reason I found out about Sarah is because a close friend of mine was part of one of Sarah's group programs and told me about how transformative it was to gather in a space with only other mixed people and have dedicated time to process through challenging moments from the past that have occupied a lot of brain space. Sarah also runs a course for parents of mixed children, but that's a whole other conversation that I'm certain we'll have at another point. Sarah calls her virtual space the Mixed Bloom Room, and when people first enter it, she encourages them to set intentions and goals for their time with her.
I think the one that I see most often is the desire to feel whole. And I think a lot of that comes through just having an idea of what your story is, what your history is, and going over that intimately. Another thing that comes up is, how do I use my privileges and what are they?
As we talked about, folks can experience colorism even within their own families. Different siblings can look really different, have different skin tones and different skin shades. Can you talk to me about how you encourage folks to start those conversations with their families and how that can be a space for healing?
I think that it's really important to address the pains that you have in a safe environment because it is very scary to address with family. And one of the most important aspects about being able to address things with other people who do not share your experience is having the language. And a lot of people do not have the language. So I think it's really important to learn the language of your experience, learn the language of the mixed race experience because there are commonalities, and do the healing that you can before you take that into your family. And then when you do, you just do it with love and grace and an open heart.
I love that description of developing the language and understanding the language. And I think it has a lot to do with narrative and understanding the narratives that we've been told about mixed race identity and maybe some of the rewriting we can do of those narratives for ourselves. What are some of the narratives that you've observed that you think are harmful for mixed folks in thinking about and processing their identity?
I think that one of the most common narratives is that mixed people don't belong anywhere, which obviously that's not true. But if you hear something again and again and again, you can internalize that narrative. Another one is that mixed people are confused. What I see in the course is that mixed people are not confused. Maybe the experience is nuanced. Maybe the experience is layered
Mm.
or even complex. But once they start going through their story and learning the language from the other people in the cohort, they say, Actually, I'm not confused. I'm very clear on what my story is and where I come from and who I am and what my experience is like. And look, I have all this affirmation in the cohort, so I'm not confused, and that's really powerful.
One of the terms that I've heard you talk about in an interview that you did is this mixed chatter. And it's this kind of internal
Mhm.
dialogue that can ramp up for people when you start being really aware of how people are perceiving you. And it's this just like internal noise that is keeping you from being in the moment in a lot of ways. Can you talk about mixed chatter and the role it plays for folks?
Yes, it really is about those narratives and gatekeeping. Oh, what are you? Oh, no, you're not mixed. There's a lot of gatekeeping that goes on for mixed people. And so the mixed chatter can really, man, it's a detriment. It's kind of heartbreaking because it doesn't allow you to show up as your full, authentic self. And it doesn't allow other people to then show up as their authentic self. So it's one of the things that we work on. And I think a lot of it, starts with observing it. Like, what is your chatter? What are you worried about? Why are you worried about those things? Where did that come from? And then through the whole process, what I've seen is that the mixed chatter sort of just kind of dies down. And that allows so much more space for like just being.
I want to talk with you about a moment that comes up for me immediately when I hear you describe mixed chatter, which is it happened pretty recently. I was at a conference and I was in a group of 3 other Asian women. We were talking about the experience of taking our friends, our white friends, to get food. We were just talking about to get food. And I was about to, say something about taking friends to get Indian food. And I had this moment where I realized that I wasn't sure that they knew that I was Indian. And I started to have all of this chatter where it was like, okay, should I frame this question in a way that makes it clear that I'm Indian? Should I just talk about getting Indian food and assume that they know? And I felt super paralyzed. And that chatter got very, very loud. And I
Yeah.
would love to know, how would you walk me through thinking through this and thinking about kind of deconstructing some of that mixed chatter? I'm going to put you on the spot for some coaching here.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a whole course for that, Anita. But I would say that the next time that happens, to sort of observe what your thoughts are around it.
Hmm.
What are you afraid of?
I'm afraid that they are going to think a way about me, I guess, think that I'm like an imposter and
Mm,
I'm like injecting myself into a space where I don't belong.
mm. That is a super common mixed experience. And what I would say to that is just, send you some love and a hug around that.
Hmm.
And then we can talk off radio. Hon- Honestly, like,
Yeah, no, that's super helpful though, just to name. I mean, even at having you ask me to name what I'm afraid of, I don't think I've even
yeah,
really gotten there. Like the chatter is so repetitive that
yeah.
I don't slow it down enough to
Yeah.
notice that.
Yeah. One of the things that we work on in the course is this idea that you make sense because we're told that we don't make sense. So I was born in 1969 in Marin County, which is totally white. And it's in California. So there's a very particular way of speaking, basically, how I'm speaking right now. And my mom is white. My dad, he was black. I did not grow up with him. I did not grow up with my black family. I grew up in Marin County with a bunch of white people, and this Marin County is super hippy dippy and super like, oh, we don't see color. And so nothing was discussed. And I was very alone. But I grew up around white people.
Mm.
So when people meet me, they're like, you don't make any sense because my phenotype is, I get read as black and not mixed quite often. Actually, if you knew where I was born, when I was born, who my parents are, how I was raised, who my friends and family are, actually, I make perfect sense.
That's really beautiful. And I can imagine getting to a point where you can say that to yourself and you really believe it would be really healing.
Yes, it is really healing. And it is actually just true. You can't really argue with yourself around that one. You make sense because you are. And this is why. This is the context.
And as you said, you can find community through story and narrative, through knowing your own,
Hmm.
through finding yourself in other people's stories. And that can be a really powerful tool for healing.
A lot of the groups on Instagram have meetups. And I also see this in the mixed adults course when you have like a little group of mixed people and someone is talking about their experience and everyone else is nodding their head like, "Oh yeah,
Hmm.
that resonates with me." That barely ever happens for us. So, if you can find a community where you're getting that head nodding, that kind of experience is very, very healing. It's healing.
I am still working on building that community for myself. Having my sister live close by has been huge, and I've stayed really tight with a few friends from college who I always turn to process mixed life moments. But I'd certainly love to develop more mixed friendships. So if you're someone listening who wants to be part of at least a virtual version of that with me, reach out. For real, I want to meet you. From talking with Claire and Adiah, I learned that a lot of us could have been helped by spaces for multiracial students at school. When I went to college, there definitely wasn't one at UNC. So it's really cool now to see that some mixed race students are taking matters into their own hands.
Hi, my name is Naomi Vanderlip, and I am a senior at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and I am also the co-founder and president of our Cal Poly's Multiracial Students Association. Growing up, I was just told, oh, you're so lucky, the best of both worlds. I never had any conversations about my upbringing with other multiracial people. It was a fact. I would just say, oh, I'm Chinese, Dutch, and French. In college, I've really had to think about my identity. Being multiracial isn't just the best of both worlds, but there's a lot of nuance there. For instance, like not feeling a sense of belonging. Like when we're joining cultural clubs, there's a common theme that we didn't really feel like we belonged, that we weren't enough of one race. I took it into my own hands to create my own space for that. And I think that's really powerful. I realize a lot of people like me, especially young adults, haven't really thought about being multiracial until it's been glaring. Like just being forced to think about it has really made me more proud and made me able to put my emotions that I've been feeling for about 2 decades into words.
I am so excited for Naomi and all the folks in her orbit who will build this community that a lot of us really crave. Over the course of this conversation, we've been kind of circling around this idea of dissonance between how people perceive mixed folks and how we feel on the inside. For Claire and Adiah, it's an ongoing journey to feel strong enough in their personal identity that other people's perceptions don't matter as much.
Yeah, to be like totally honest, don't know if I've made that much progress in resolving that dissonance. And I do like really remember like every person that said like, oh, when I first met you, I thought you were white, or when I first met you, I thought you were just Chinese, or like, I do really like focus on those things, like what other people have told me. But I took Chinese classes at school because I grew up speaking Chinese, but I never learned how to read or write. So I've been learning how to read and write, and that's been really cool. Helps me feel like closer to my family and more connected. So that's been helpful, but I think it's definitely like a learning curve, and I'm still working on it.
Oh, 100%. I certainly am too. Adiah, how about you?
Absolutely. It definitely does feel like a process, and I am reassured by the fact that I'm like 21 and that I have a little bit of time to kind of
Oh,
like
yeah,
really
so much
explore
time.
it, like so much time. But I feel like recently, especially, I'm like working towards getting my BFA in writing, and I feel like in terms of the art that I've been creating, I've been trying to lean more into telling mixed and Black stories, like talking about that dissonance in a way that feels like earnest. I found that when I was growing up, I would tell the people in my life that I identified as just like fully Black. I'm going to ignore anything else because this is what I look like and this is how I'm being treated. But I think now that I'm older and kind of experiencing like the ways in which that I benefit from being light-skinned, or the ways in which that I'm treated differently than like a fully Black person would be, I'm like leaning a little bit more into exploring like the dissonance and the disconnect. So I've been writing as though, yes, I'm unique in my own way, but also this is just like my life and this is just how I identify. And I find that that's been really helpful overall in my journey, like creating characters and worlds in which it's okay to explore that dissonance without it being like scary.
Embodied is a production of North Carolina Public Radio WUNC. a listener-supported station. If you want to lend your support to this podcast, consider a contribution at WUNC.org now. Storytelling like Embodied is only possible because of listeners like you. This episode was produced by Kaya Finlay. Paige Perez also produces for our show, and Amanda Magnus is our editor. Skylar Chadwick is our intern, and Jenny Lawson is our sound engineer. Quilla wrote our theme music. And a special thanks to all the people who contributed to this episode, including Naomi, Gabrielle, and Sarah R. If you have a story to share with us, thoughts about a recent episode, or ideas about a topic you want us to cover, leave us a message at our virtual mailbox SpeakPipe. You can find a link in our show notes. Thanks so much for listening to Embodied. And if you like the show, please spread the word in your own networks. Word of mouth recommendations to your friends or family are the best way to support our podcast, and we so appreciate it. Until next time, I'm Anita Rao, taking on the taboo with you.